discussing national and international issues. You're listening to Pelle Neroth Taylor on today's News Talk, TNT.
Welcome to the Pelle Neroth Taylor Show on this Monday afternoon. Well, it's holiday or holiday mood in parts of the Anglosphere. I think it's a holiday in the United States, Memorial Day, and you've got bank holiday in the UK. Sweden doesn't have a holiday, but there is a sort of, I don't know, nostalgic feeling for me in the air that it's the end of term and we had a big thunderstorm. And as I was cycling to my studio, I saw a couple of girls in white dresses going to school, perhaps for the last time in their career, because they looked to be about 14 or 15, heading to high school. And I remember very well my last day of school in Sweden before I headed to England, and standing on the steps of my school with a wet copy of my final report. We were all desperately comparing grades, and that was my sort of farewell to Scandinavia. And then I went to live in England for 30 years. And very happily too. But there's something to do with the smell of the rain on the flowers, I think. Something to do with the smell also being the last thing that you remember when you die, but also one that calls out the strongest memories because of some connection between your sense of smell and your oldest memories or something. Anyway, so that was that. Well, we've got four excellent guests today, as usual. We've got Sumit Ganguly, Shumit, I think is pronounced, who's a professor, a distinguished professor of political science in India, or in Indiana, rather, who is going to talk to us about the election that's coming up and some of India's diplomatic choices going forward, whoever wins, or rather, Narendra Modi's probably going to win, but he has sort of fallen on hard times in his relationships with America, but will he take the step and get closer to China? Well, Shumit has written many books on the Sino-Indian relationship, and these two giants of Asia have had quite a difficult relationship over the years, and it's a relationship dynamic that we sometimes ignore in the West, focused as we are on the Atlantic maritime powers versus Russia. But anyway, so they'll be very looking forward to that. We've got a second guest. We've obviously got the European elections coming up in 2 weeks' time or something. Ralph Schoellhammer, who's professor of international relations at Vienna University. He's going to talk about the migration crisis, what's going on in Germany. There's a song that's making the rounds about immigrants have to go out. And somebody's recorded the chant of some youths in a German holiday resort, some white, well-off youths, and that's been put to a 1990s trance song, and it's gone viral on the internet. And the German powers that be are very angry about that. So Ralph's going to be talking about that, and he's also going to talk about the potential of the various parties on the right to actually do well. I don't think they're going to do it, but maybe they'll pull off a surprise, because the European publics are not at all happy with what's going on at the moment with immigration, war, high prices, and so on, and the seemingly rock solid support for the mainstream parties in the European Parliament. And I'm talking about this not so much because the European Parliament is so hugely important, but because it's a central indicator of where opinion in different European countries stands, and it all coalesces, of course, in this multinational election taking place with all the 27 member states voting for a European Parliament, which then has some kind of power inside the European Union, but not as much as many people think. We've got Anne van der Steel, who's with us from the United States. She's the chairwoman of the Zelenko Foundation, and she's telling us about the pandemic treaty, the WHO thing, which apparently fell through just before the weekend. Does it have a chance of being resurrected, or what's really going on there? I mean, sounds incredibly good news if the WHO decided to drop it. I've had a huge number of guests who are very unhappy about this totalitarian sort of power grab by international unelected bureaucrats, but who knows? Maybe there's a good sign of good thing. We're also going to talk about Trump's growing popularity with the blacks and Latinos. He was in the Bronx recently, a couple of days ago, and getting down there. And lots of posts on X with very happy people saying they might vote for Trump, and in a tight election that could make the difference. So he's toned down a lot of his anti-immigration rhetoric, I think, and going for the sort of blue-collar vote in that section of the population. He's also spoken to the Libertarian Party convention. I'm probably a libertarian myself, anti-war, anti-government, and so on. and some of them booed him, but then he pulled out a rabbit out of the hat at the very last moments, showman that he is, and that seemed to have persuaded a lot. So we'll be talking to Anne van der Seal what that rabbit out of the hat was, and why it might be a game changer. It's sort of got to do with the imprisonment of the so-called the kind of Julian Assange of the American libertarian movement, a man I have to confess I'd never heard of before, and that shows you that you need to pay much more attention to his case. He's been jailed, many people think unfairly, for 13 or 14 years. Finally, after Anne, a final guest on this Monday afternoon, we've got Patrick Linden, who's sort of our longevity correspondent. He goes to conferences and talks to people who basically trying to talk about biohacking ourselves, that is, trying different combinations of medicines, different gene therapies, and so on, to make our lives longer and better, because there's no reason why we should die at the age of 80 or 70. We could live 150 or even 300 years. Patrick is an expert on the moral side, philosophical side of it, because he thinks that we all live under collective death wish has been honed down the centuries to make us accept death. But he thinks that that psychological barrier needs to be dismantled and overcome, and then the science will take care of itself the way it's going. So he's written The Case Against Death, but he's also a man who keeps us up to date on all the various conferences are saying. Interestingly, one of the takeaways, the stories, is that the billionaires are not cryogenically freezing their heads and saving up for an immortal existence. They're behind the curve on this one, surprisingly. Anyway, the longevity movement does need more money, but a lot of basic hacks can also extend your lives, and I'll be talking about those in my next monologue. Before we got our guest on, I just want to talk a little bit about the UK elections. Well, the Tories are touting national service, and that hasn't gone down too well. Meanwhile, I wanted to highlight, because it is, after all, a holiday Monday, something that could summarize the Tory government. Supposedly, they're supposed to be conservatives, but how conservative are they really? We've got a case where, I'll read from the Daily Mail, NHS chiefs are facing landmark legal action after 26 female hospital nurses protested about being forced to share a woman's changing room with a transgender colleague who is biologically male. So basically, it's this bloke, I mean, let's call it what it is, a spade, a bloke walking around in boxer shorts with holes in them. He's been trying very recently to impregnate his girlfriend back home. I mean, you know, if he's a female, then I'm a fish, you know. But because of the NHS legislation, he's allowed to walk around in this women's changing rooms and taunt them and harass them, and while calling himself transgender, that is, of female. But the nurses found themselves intimidated and upset, especially if the man goes around saying, "When are you going to get undressed?" But the human resources managers at the hospital trust allegedly said that the female nurses need to be more inclusive, broaden their mindset, and to be educated and attend training to accept the fact that this man is in fact a woman. It's all very Monty Python somehow. But the nurses are complaining that international nurses, that is, you know, Muslim nurses, are having to wear extra clothing underneath their uniforms, which means that they live a day in boiling. They live very, very hot. Meanwhile, other colleagues are taking to changing in the disabled toilet in the ward to avoid the trans nurse because they feared their discomfort would impact on patient safety. One quoted, "We are not allowed to go home in our uniforms for infection control purposes, but because we're so nervous about this person walking in, people have decided to maybe chance it." Well, there you go. That's 14 years of Tory rule, and we've got this. I won't say it's by any means the most important story of the day, but it was irresistible. Anyways, I think we can. We've got our first guest. We're going to talk about India, this hugely important country, with probably one of the most insightful and most brilliant professors talking about Indian diplomacy and politics. He's written many books about it, and he'll be back with us after a very quick break. This is the Pelle Neroth Taylor Show on TNT News Talk.
Your voice heard here.
The government needs to step up and do its job.
Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Welcome back to the Pelle Neroth Taylor Show on this Monday afternoon. Well, we've got Shumit, I think, Ganguly, who's a distinguished professor of political science and holds the Rabindranath Tagore Chair in Indian Cultures and Civilizations at Indiana University in Bloomington. Professor Ganguly has previously taught at James Madison College of Michigan State University, Hunter College, and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and the University of Texas at Austin. He's been a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, a visiting fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation and the Center on Democracy and Development and the Rule of Law at Stanford University. He's written a number of books, including A Short Introduction to Indian Foreign Policy, Deadly Empires, Indo-Pakistani Relations at the Dawn of a New Century, Ascending India and Its State Capacity, and the Oxford Handbook of India's National Security. And I thought we'd talk about a book that's just came out in 2023, the Sino-Indian rivalry. Welcome to the show, Professor.
Thank you.
Very delighted to have you on. I read with great interest this book on the Sino-Indian rivalry, because as I was saying in my introduction, we very much sort of, from our Eurocentric perspective, we talk about the Atlantic powers, the island powers versus the world heartland, meaning mainly Russia and China, and how the West controls the finance and the shipping lanes, and Russia and China control the land, the big land and the agricultural areas. And India sometimes falls by the wayside. But of course, India is the largest country by population in the world and has been growing like 7 or 8% a year, and hugely important. And what I got from your book was this dynamic that's playing out in Asia, over water supplies in Tibet, over China extending its reach around the Indian Ocean. You're looking for ports on the Indian Ocean coast. You're fighting with the Bridge and Road Initiative. So it's all very interesting game playing out there. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on in the Indian-Chinese relationship, the geopolitical relationship?
Well, the Sino-Indian relationship has been quite fraught for some time. And during the 1990s, there was a fond hope entertained by many in the Indian elite that growing trade and investment in China and Chinese investment in India would essentially enable the two countries to set aside their rivalry and the border dispute, and economic interdependence would become the solvent and would thereby enable the two countries to cooperate across the Himalayas, and the border dispute could be simply kicked down the road and dealt with at some point by a successor government. Well, the Indians got a rude awakening in the early part of the 21st century, and most specifically in 2014, when Xi Jinping was visiting India and was actually in Prime Minister Modi's home state of Gujarat, when an important incursion took place in a disputed territory in extreme northwestern India. And from that point on, the Indians started to fret much more about the People's Republic of China and its intentions towards India, and started to back away from this notion that economic interdependence could be a solvent. And then, of course, in 2020, there was a major incursion once again by the People's Liberation Army, and leading to the deaths of a substantial number of Indian soldiers and an unspecified number of PLA personnel. And since then, the relationship has significantly deteriorated.
That's interesting. And how do you, what I loved about parts of the book that I read was, for instance, this idea that we don't think about that, but you're facing these competition for resources, like water resources. So obviously China has Tibet, but India relies on Tibet for much of its water. And the Chinese diverting their water to irrigate their farmlands through complex pieces of engineering? Are they depriving you of that?
There's no question about it that they're depriving India of water. They're placing dams on the upper reaches of the Brahmaputra River, which flows into the northeastern Indian state of Assam. And the Indians are quite concerned about it and have raised their concerns with the PRC, but mostly have found themselves rebuffed. So the unfortunate problem is that China is what's called an upper riparian state. They control the headwaters of the Brahmaputra River, which they can easily divert. And India, as the lower riparian state, could face significant problems, hydrological problems in the foreseeable future.
Okay, we'll carry on talking about India's resistance to Chinese expansion in the Indian Ocean. I think we've got these island chains, and we've got the BRI, the initiative in the Middle East. But we're first going to go into a very quick break for adverts. I'm back very shortly. This is the Pelle Neroth Taylor Show on TNT News Talk.
It sounds pretty good. It sounds real, dude. Not bad, huh?
This is today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Welcome back to the Pelle Neroth Taylor Show. We've got Professor Ganguly with us, who's talking to us about Indian foreign policy. India, of course, undergoing the world's largest democratic election. I think the final results will be available on June the 4th. I think Narendra Modi, the incumbent, is expected to win. But of course, we're all waiting with bated breath on what the Indians are going to do after, because it is sort of in the middle there, the Indians between these two emerging vast blocks. And I think everyone that's more closely than perhaps for decades, people are watching this election. So, Professor Ganguly, the Chinese have a hold on you there via their prevent India from getting water. What are they doing in terms of expanding their trade and military presence in areas that are close and of interest to India, like the Indian Ocean?
They've been doing that for some time, and they've made significant inroads into Bangladesh, into Sri Lanka, and of course, they have what's called an all-weather relationship with Pakistan, which has been at odds with India since the very independence of these two countries from the British Indian Empire in 1947. And they have significantly strengthened and bolstered their relationship with Pakistan along multiple axes, diplomatic, military, economic. And in fact, they have in many ways kept Pakistan afloat through the provision of loans, except the sad part is Pakistan is practically now in hock to the People's Republic of China, having taken substantial loans, which they have no real capacity to pay back anytime in the near future. Also, in part because of Indian maladroitness in terms of dealing with its smaller neighbors like Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and the Maldives, China has made significant inroads into these countries, has taken advantage of India's occasional lapses, and has invested significantly in these countries. And the Chinese have deep pockets, so they can easily outwit the Indians in terms of financial assistance to these countries. And consequently, India is now desperately trying to play a catch-up game in terms of trying to improve diplomatic ties with Sri Lanka, with the Maldives, and with Bangladesh. I also neglected to mention Nepal, where China also has a very substantial presence and has also exploited quite deftly some of the errors that Indian policymakers have made over the years.
Mm. We might have time to go into those topics specifically about those countries, right? But I just wanted to pivot for a moment over to Iran, where India has just helped equip this port, I think, on the Iranian south coast. And of course, the Azerbaijanis, which neighbor Iran, and then Russia to the north. There's talk of this transport corridor. So the Russians want to be able to sell stuff to the Indians, and the Indians want to build up a better commercial relationship with Russia, which will avoid having shipping transit through, the world's oceans. How does India see this Russia relationship developing? Is it going to be a counterweight to China, and how much does it anger the Americans that the Indians are doing this?
Let me start with the last part of your question. The Americans, I think, have been remarkably understanding and have mostly avoided publicly upbraiding the Indians on this issue of the relationship with Russia, because I think Washington, D.C. has a fairly sophisticated understanding of why India is turning to Russia. And the reasons are mostly threefold. One, there's a historical legacy that during the Cold War, when for complex reasons, much of the Western world, and particularly the United States, was at odds with India, Russia was a steadfast partner. And the memories of that period linger in the minds of the Indian foreign policy elite. That's the first factor, this form of Cold War nostalgia about the Soviet Union and its principal successor state, Russia. Second, close to 70% of India's weaponry is either of Soviet or Russian origin. And consequently, India cannot easily walk away from that defense partnership. Even though the Indians have sought to diversify their weapons acquisitions in the recent past, they are still acutely dependent on the Russians for spare parts and certain forms of sophisticated weaponry, which the Indians cannot obtain from elsewhere because of fears of technology seepage and also because of costs. Third, India also is concerned that upbraiding Russia for its invasion of Ukraine could lead to a strengthening of the Sino-Russian relationship. And for India, the long-term threat, security threat, comes from the People's Republic of China. So these are the three principal reasons why the Indians are still maintaining a relationship with Russia.
And it allows them to play. I mean, you're getting a lot of cheap oil from Russia, so it's mutually beneficial there, I suppose. And I think some of the Indian oil is being resold to Europe. So the Europe, having sanctioned Russia, are finding themselves buying Russian goods with an Indian markup, I understand.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry. This is a really curious situation. The Indians are buying Russian oil at less than market rates, largely because it enables them to tamp down on inflation, given that close to 80% of the hydrocarbons that India uses were coming from the Middle East. So the Russian pipeline, in many ways, is alleviating an economic conundrum in India. And yes, as you correctly point out, this is the ultimate irony. India is selling part of this oil to Western Europe. even though Western Europe and particularly the United States have imposed significant and extensive sanctions on Russia.
Professor Ganguly, we're just going to go into a news break, but after the break, we'll carry on talking. We're going to say, where is Indian foreign policy heading after the election? Is there going to be a change of compass? And we're also going to go back into the archives, as it were, and down memory lane, or whatever you want to call it, and look at India's attempt to be a sort of global conscience for the global South, and if there's some of that spirit left in the Indian diplomacy. This is the Pelle Neroth Daily Show on TNT News Talk. We'll be back after a quick news break.
What's happening?
Big news.
Big news.
Big news. The biggest breaking news story.
Holy crap.
TNT Radio News.
Matt Boyland here with your TNT headlines. Just days after it was ordered by the World Court to stop its offensive in Rafah, Israel's gone ahead and bombed a safe zone in the city, killing dozens of Palestinians and wounding scores more. 12 people have been injured, 8 of them taken to hospital after yet another Boeing passenger jet was apparently hit by severe turbulence. And Ukraine started sending prisoners to the front line, with the first of 4,500 convicts already on the battlefield.
Why not give TNT Radio a follow? We're on all major social platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Gab, and Getter. Help us get the word out as we cover the biggest topics of our time right here on today's News Talk. TNT Radio. TNT Radio.
Welcome back to the Pelle Neroth Taylor Show. We've got Shumit Ganguly, who's a distinguished professor of political science and holds the Rabindranath Tagore Chair in Indian Cultures and Civilizations at Indiana University, Bloomington. And we're talking about the election and in India, which of course is going to be finalized in early June. And then probably Narendra Modi, the incumbent, will win. But the question is by how much and what sort of foreign policy we can expect from India after the election. Professor, do you think there are going to be any changes, or is it going to be the same course as before?
I think for the most part, there will be considerable continuity in Indian foreign policy. The fascinating thing will be to see if the current foreign minister, who was a distinguished Indian diplomat with a stellar career, who decided to join politics and become the foreign minister, whether or not he will continue in office, or will he be moved to, say, to the position of the National Security Advisor, given that the National Security Advisor is in his 80s now, in reasonably good health, but when one is in one's 80s, invariably things happen to one's body. So there's some talk in New Delhi that he might be moved to the position of the National Security Advisor, but that's hardly certain. Even if that happens, he will still remain an important confidant to Prime Minister Modi. And this kind of hyper-realism that he has embraced, and going back to our discussion of cheap oil from Russia, where he has simply shrugged his shoulders and publicly stated that, look, what do you expect us to do? We are a poor country and we don't have the luxury of buying oil on the global market. And if the Russians are prepared to give us cheap oil, well, we'll buy it. And this reflects a kind of sort of extreme tough-mindedness in Indian foreign policy, which he has come to characterize. And my suspicion is that this will continue well after the election.
You're talking about Jai Shankar.
Yes, Subramaniam Jaishankar,
Subramaniam,
current foreign minister.
What I've seen of him is quite impressive. I mean, he's an impressive, highly intelligent figure, as you say. We're just going to go back. Unfortunately, we've got 6 minutes left of this particular interview. But in our pre-interview, when I wrote to you, I mean, I just wrote a book about Dag Hammarskjöld, the Swedish UN Secretary General, and of course, he died in an air crash in 1961. I don't think it was an accident. And there are many. There's a UN ongoing investigation, if you like. And I think I mean, reading between the lines, they don't think it's an accident either, and they point to the Americans and the Brits as having duty of care. So if they didn't do it, they were around when it happened, and there maybe some French mercenaries who carried out or something. But the Indians played a huge role in that whole Congo expedition, and I'm just wondering what you think, because there was the leader of the UN in Congo was a guy called Dayal, and he irritated the Americans no end. But I think he's a rather impressive character, highly intelligent and imperious, but probably maybe lacking some people skills. And I'm wondering what Nehru, who was behind the scenes there, working quite well with Dag Hammarskjöld and quite well with Kennedy, I think, who's president. I think my theory is that Hammarskjöld was trying to create a new UN alignment with the Indians heading the global south, and then the Americans, the idealistic Kennedy, and maybe even bringing in the Russians. And in doing so, he was excluding the Brits and the French from their usual playground in Africa, and that's what irritated the colonial powers no end. Do you have any thoughts about this period? Because I know you've written books about Indian diplomats and Indian diplomacy, and that you read the Dayal book.
Yes, Rajeshwar Dayal was one of India's most able diplomats, and was trusted by Hammarskjöld, and given the task of dealing with this extraordinarily complex and difficult issue in the Congo. And he wrote an important book which was published by Princeton University Press in this country. And he was desperately trying to act as a mediator and diffuse that crisis, though his sympathies clearly lay with the Congolese, being a diplomat from a former colony, from a former British colony. And he had Nehru's complete confidence. And Nehru had taken an acute interest in foreign affairs, and was his own foreign minister, and was in routine contact with Dayal, and wanted to play a vital role in not only in decolonization, but also in limiting the influence of the colonial powers in the post-colonial world.
And but did that attempt, would you say India's had its ups and downs in its attempts to be a global voice? Because maybe it's only because of my areas of focus. That seems to be like a high point of Indian attempts at influence, and then India kind of faded away. Is that me being wrong just because I've studied this period and not other periods? Or did India suffer a blow? We've got only about a minute and a half left. Did India suffer a blow from this, or has India been active all throughout?
No, you're quite right. It's actually sort of been uneven. There have been ebbs and flows. But the real blow came in 1962 with the Chinese attack in October of 1962, from which Nehru never recovered. And by 1964, after a second heart attack, he was dead. And his successor, Lal Bahadur Shastri, lasted in office only for a few months. He distinguished himself while in office, but was not around for any length of time. And his daughter, Indira Gandhi, while she continued with Nehru's rhetoric about the global South and the like, simply did not have the qualities of head and heart that her father had possessed. And thereby, while India maintained that rhetoric, its influence significantly diminished in the 1970s and the 1980s.
We've got a very short time. Incredibly interesting. Would you say that India is seeking? Well, first thing I want to say was obviously that isn't one of the things that the Congress Party, which is Nehru's and Indira's party, lambasted for their supposedly pro-Chinese tendencies, and that's part of a political football in the Indian debate. Anyway, does India have this third world conscience view that it used to have, or Modi's not interested in that game?
He talks a good line about it, but Quite frankly, that's mostly a smokescreen today.
Right.
I think the kind of moral commitment, the ethical commitment that someone like Nehru had, I think is now absent. It's mostly a kind of rhetorical flourish that characterizes Indian foreign policy.
Okay, Professor Sumit Ganguly, I'm very sorry I have to end there. This is the Pelle Neroth Taylor Show. We'll have you on again, and the Indian election will be following it until the day that happens. Incredibly interesting discussion there about Indian foreign policy and where it's going. The world's largest democracy, obviously. Thank you very much. We're going to go into a break, and then our next guest is coming on. Thank you very much.
It's been said that when someone you love has Parkinson's, you have Parkinson's. The truth is, Parkinson's disease doesn't just affect the diagnosed. It affects everyone who supports and helps care for them. Worldwide, over 10 million people are living with Parkinson's, a neurological disease that affects movement. And with so many places to search for information, it can be difficult to know where to begin. The Parkinson's Foundation has answers. Answers for everyone in the fight. We can help you understand the disease, help you find expert care, give you tips for living a better life, share the latest research, help you find local support, and there's a free helpline you can call. Find your answers and join us in the fight against Parkinson's. To learn more, please go to parkinson.org or call 1-800-4PD-INFO. The Parkinson's Foundation. Better lives together.
Around here, bushfire is just a part of life. We've been through it before, and we'll get through it again. The people here all look out for each other. We're a community that does its bit to plan and prepare, to keep everyone safe. We live with bushfire, so we live bushfire ready.
I was such a young age. Everything changed. My name is Chloe. When I was 13, my dad was diagnosed with cancer. When I found out, I just didn't know how to react. I felt like everything was just kind of closing in on me. It just became a routine. Dad's doing chemo. I'd come home from school, wait for Mum to finish work, and we'd go straight to the hospital, spend a few hours there, just draw. It was hard to navigate going to school, hundreds of kids, and I was the only one with a dying dad. He was diagnosed in March, and then he died in October. Towards the end, I heard about Canteen. It kind of felt nice to know that I had other people like me. They understood what I was going through, and we didn't even have to chat about cancer. In 2020, I became a youth ambassador, so I can help others the way they helped me. I've done so many things since I was 13. I've graduated high school, university, gotten my licence, made a move across the country. Life now is just a whole lot more fun. Please give a gift today to support more young people like me experiencing cancer.
Deconstructing psyops, propaganda, and mainstream media garbage. Pelle Neroth Taylor on today's News Talk, TNT.
Welcome back to the Pelle Neroth Taylor Show on this Monday afternoon. Well, Germany seems to be undergoing a period of malaise at the moment. It's got sinking academic results. A lot of people talking about the country deindustrializing as the manufacturing sector tanks because of high energy costs. We've got growing concerns about migration and growing concerns about censorship, and not all doom and gloom in Europe's largest and most important economy and country. Well, we've got Ralf Schoellhammer, who's an assistant professor of international relations at the Webster Vienna Private University, and he podcasts at the 1020. His research has a particular emphasis on culture, values, and ideologies and how they influence state behavior. He's written a lot for Unheard, great website, by the way, Spiked, the Wall Street Journal, and other publications about energy, geopolitics, and things like immigration. Welcome to the show, Ralph.
Well, Pelle, thanks so much for having me. Looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely, yeah, because I'm in Sweden. Sweden feels very close to Germany culturally, especially northern Germany. When I go to Hamburg or something, it feels like very close, and think the same. You know, Swedes are a bit softer than the Germans, though. You have there's this song going through the Twitter called Ausländer Haus, and that seems to be saying something about the German opinion because it's gone viral. Can you tell us a little bit what's going on there and how the yeah.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting story, right? Exactly what you say. There is now kind of this uproar in Germany. All the public broadcasters have picked up on it. The German Chancellor talked about it. The Minister of the Interior, Nancy Faeser, talked about it. Basically, what happened, I don't know how many of your listeners are familiar with Gigi D'Agostino. I remember, I'm now in my early 40s, like he was really popular around 2000. I admit
I remember
this was before. Yeah, I mean, actually, no, he was filling the discotheques, I think, from Ibiza to Vienna. So very, very popular at the time. And basically, one of his songs, I think it's called L'amour toujours. I don't speak French, so I hope I didn't butcher this entirely. And as you correctly pointed, there is kind of a change in lyrics into Ausländer raus, which basically means, in rough translation, foreigners go away, foreigners leave the country. Now, what made this story very interesting is that those who have been caught on tape singing this song were not like poor working class individuals. It was actually on the island of Sylt, which is kind of a noble vacation spot for the upper class German youth. And I think what makes this remarkable is we see now that not only has kind of frustration with mass migration in Germany also kind of fed into the meme culture, we see now it's also something that's increasingly taking hold throughout all socioeconomic dimensions. So this is not just, usually the argument is always, it's the uneducated, the poor, like those, they don't understand other cultures. But the higher you go up, the more educated, or I think as you and I would call it, the more indoctrinated you are, the more time you have spent at a university where you are marinated in a left-leaning worldview, the less hostile you are to migration. But what we see now, even those once kind of aspiring McKinsey consultants can now be caught singing a song that, at least in a somewhat humorous way, right, tries to make a fairly harsh point in saying, we don't want a mass migration to continue, and that others should leave the country. I mean, there was also one guy, I think this is, of course, this I would say is significantly also more problematic, who was imitating a Hitler mustache and kind of quasi making the Hitler salute. Yes, I mean, it's not a pretty scene, but the thing is always that the Austrian writer and philosopher Karl Kraus once said, the scandal begins where the police puts an end to it. And I think this is a similar situation. So this is not a pretty sight, but it is not something that the Chancellor has to chime in. The Minister of Interior has to talk about this. Okay, this was a group of young people. It was a stupid song. The meme has been around for a long time, right? Again, not something that probably you and I would do, but it's neither the end of the world, nor it's a huge scandal. But now it kind of becomes one, I would say, for the other side, because it's catching on now. Right, because now you it's a little bit, sorry, last point. I know I'm 10 to monologue, but it's the last point.
No,
but it's a little bit like the Let's Go Brandon phenomenon as it was with Joe Biden in the United States, right? Yeah. Which was also kind of a code for something else.
Yeah. No, it's you could talk for as long as you like. It's an incredibly interesting subject. But did this Gigi Agostino song, was it before did they put words to the song added after these posh youths chanted it, or was it the song and the words before that?
It has been around for a long time. It has been around for a long time.
So they were singing along to a song that was, and I know Gigi Agostino. Okay, I get it. And then I saw, well, and a very pretty woman. Sorry,
yes,
carry on.
The song has been around for 20 years. I think these kind of, let's say, more politically salient lyrics have been, quote unquote, added around 6 years ago. And apparently now it has entirely broken into the mainstream.
Yeah, right. And I saw this very pretty young woman, looked like a young DJ, in what looked like a bathroom or something, or at a public toilet, in a mixing deck making it. And then and some young Eastern German youths running around chanting that song. So there you have the span of German culture. I mean, as you said, it's not just posh, and it's not just underprivileged Eastern German young men or whatever. Well, so, and it's broken into the mainstream. So what is the bien pensant, the German journalists and political class? They must be absolutely outraged at this.
Well, it is exactly what you can expect, right? I mean, this is the steps need to be taken, and there need to be penalties, and And all these young people have now been doxxed, right? Their addresses and their employers have been put on social media. I think one young girl who participated has now lost her job. So it's pretty much interesting. So just 2 weeks ago, just kind of to give you a comparison, 2 weeks ago, a similar thing happened to German academics that supported that supported Hamas and, kind of were accusing Israel of genocide. Whatever one thinks about this, it's a separate topic. But it happened to them, and everybody said, this is unacceptable. You cannot publish somebody's address. You cannot publish somebody's employer. But apparently now with these young people, it's no problem, and it's kind of an heroic act to do it. And this is, I think, why this could backfire. Because I'm sure you remember, you most certainly have reported on it, I assume, when you had these young Muslims a couple of weeks ago who were demonstrating for the caliphate. There is still a significant uptick. I think you know this as well as I do. It's the same problem in Sweden, an uptick in gang violence, in what we, I guess, can call rape culture in certain migrant groups. And there's just a sense that somehow this never is treated with the same importance in the media as a group of young people singing this song. I'll give you another example. A couple of years ago, this was, I think, in 2017, a young girl was raped and killed by a refugee, an asylum seeker. And the reason why the media said this is not national news, they said, well, this is regional news, right? It happened on a regional level. Okay, fine, right? So if rape and murder is a regional news, then maybe young people singing a song is also regional news. And it's once again that people increasingly sense, and I think that's also true in Sweden, they say, okay, there is this attempt to make problems with migration, regional issues, something not to be talked about at a national level. But if there is a backlash, both in politics or in culture against migration politics, and yes, sometimes these things are ugly. I'm not saying they are not, but this is something to be expected, right? This is the national use, because of course, what is now being constructed is the argument that in fact the problem is not migration; it's these evil Germans who sing these songs calling for the expulsion of the migrants. But of course, that mass migration came first. And this is a reaction to it. It's kind of the causal chain that they don't want to talk about.
Well, I mean, the German debate seems exactly parallel to the Swedish one. And I wonder if the Swedes didn't get there first, in a sense that what I hear now, it was happening in Sweden 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, and I made a film about it. And I took so many notes about the outrageous sentences and the censorship culture. And I've kind of moved on to other interests a little bit. So I'm not as, and I think that the Swedish government has sobered up a bit, but it's all very familiar what you're saying. But the funny thing about Sweden, it didn't even have a Nazi past, So why are the Swedes so they're like one of the few European countries that never had an African colony, or they had one for tiny one, a fort or something. But they let in a lot of Jews after 1945, so they're less to be feel guilty about than almost anyone. But they're more so all this censorship culture, I recognize that. But what I was going to say was, well, so now we've got these European elections, and of course the mainstream media in the Anglo world are talking about the far right, they're talking about the extremists and all these things, and how they're going to make big advances. But I added up, there's the ID party and the ECR party in the European Parliament, or whatever it's called, the unmemorable titles, and together they're only expected to get, maybe 160 seats. And the EPP, which is the mainstream conservatives, are going to get about 175. And nobody really knows what they stand for. So what does this anti-immigrant surge really mean? It won't make much difference, will it? And they're talking about banning the AfD in Germany, aren't they? And there's this campaign saying that they're all spies, which reminds me very much of the anti-Trump campaign in America in 2017, when Trump was a Russian agent, So anyone who advocates limits on immigration, you hit them with the Chinese spy label or the Russian spy label. Tell us a little bit about the AfD, if their prospects are, and if they're going to if they're going to be destroyed.
Well, I don't think they will be destroyed. I mean, I would assume they will get between 15 and 17%. I don't think that the powers that are currently in charge will dare to ban them, because this is something they would lose in front of the Constitutional Court. But you raise another important topic, and it's I think we have to look at this from two sides. Now, one of it is this absurd contention, as you correctly point out, about that everybody who's right of center is a Chinese or Russian spy. Because what makes this so absurd is it has been the establishment parties that colluded with the Russians and the Chinese over decades. The AfD was never in power, right? The Freedom Party in Austria was never in power. So this idea that all the policies that have been conducted with the Russians and Chinese are somehow their fault, even though they never were in charge, is completely absurd. It is a repetition of the playbook. You're absolutely right, of what happened with Trump. The second problem, however, is I think that sometimes these parties, and despite also personally I agree with many of their positions, they get in their own way. I give you one example, like the AfD leading candidate for the European elections. I'm sure you've heard about it. For example, the Rassemblement, the French Marine Le Pen's party has now basically cancelled cooperation with the AfD because Maximilian Krah, their main candidate, said in an interview that not everybody who was a member of the SS was automatically a criminal. Now, I guess you can have a complex historical debate about, those who joined the SS voluntarily, those who were forced to join the SS. Are we talking about the Waffen-SS? Are we talking about so you can have these conversations. But if you are a right-wing politician of the AfD and an Italian journalist asks you, what's your take on the SS? You know precisely what the journalist is fishing for. You know it exactly, right? It's like them asking you, so you think Hitler is cool, right? So you don't, and if you then say, well, I think he's a swell guy, then you know what the reaction is. And I think sometimes the right honestly believes that their voters are not as smart as the voters actually are, because you don't have to pander to the SS admirers to get the vote of the Germans. The problem, as you just mentioned correctly, the problem of the German people are economically, their migration. They are not a re-engagement with the history. I mean, the history, it's constantly present, as you mentioned with Sweden, right? The shadow of the Third Reich ended after 12 years, but its shadow will be with us for 1,000 years. So in that sense, Hitler has accomplished the 1,000-year Reich. But as a right-wing politician, stick to the issues like the right wing did in Sweden to a large extent, the right wing does in the Netherlands. Stick to the issues. Don't always engage in these historical debates that are interesting, but completely besides the point. If I live in a district in Vienna or in Germany, and my school children go into classes where 70% don't speak German, that's my problem. I want somebody to take care of that problem and not talk about whether or not 80 years ago there was some good guy in the SS or if they were all bad guys. I mean, this is an interesting debate for the lecture room at a university, but this is not necessary for politics. And they always walk right into these traps. I mean, if you're a left-wing journalist, you really must say it works every time. And have to admit, I mean, it's a little bit, it's their own fault as well.
And then you have to ask, I mean, so it's worse than the crime, it's stupidity, as they say. Do you really want
that's correct.
To vote for a guy who's, as I said, it is incredibly foolish, even if you can make an historical case of hair splitting and so on. It's just bad politics, bad optics. When your case, it's like real own goal, because you could win the case without talking about the bloody Nazis. Forget about it. Don't be Nazi, repudiate Nazism, and just say, well, and I mean, I believe that you can have combined human rights perfectly. You can be left wing and actually be against immigration, and that's what left wing parties were anti-immigration, because immigration hits the workers with the lowest. It smashes the trade unions in a way, and it provides the capitalists with they can divide and conquer the poorer classes of society that way. So and I'm surprised not more left. And I've got friends who advance the case against immigration from the left. You don't need to talk about Nazism. You don't need to talk about jackboots, all that nasty kind of stuff. You can
precisely.
And you can be pro-Palestinian and against anti-immigration. I mean, you could say, well, it's terrible to massacre them, but we also have a right to our own society and so on, and keep them in a good place and be nice to them. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly, you're right.
You don't need to cede the humanitarian argument to the pro-immigrationists at all. You can be a perfectly nice person and say, well, because that's what everyone in Europe thought. Olof Palme, this famous Swedish prime minister.
Yes.
Sort of Saint Olof Palme. You read his actual papers when he was advancing propositions in the Swedish parliament in 1978. It says, our society requires hegemony, a society where everyone believes the same values and wants to pay taxes for each other, and of the same type. We're like a large family. The right wingers in Sweden dig this out, and then the left say, we want more immigration, because their patron saint Olof Palme was also against immigration. So I just quote Olof Palme when people say, you're far right or whatever. I'm not far right. Anyway, I wasn't supposed to be talking that. let's just give your prediction for, we've got half a minute left. So how will the AFD then do in the election? Can you give us some, will they manage to implement anything that, well, how will they do? You've got 20 seconds.
I think they'll still crack the 15% mark. There is another left-wing party that came up. There is a huge lots of new parties coming up on the right at the moment. So that will cost them a little bit, but the shift to the right is going to happen, and I think it will only be the beginning.
Okay. Ralf Schoellhammer, a professor at International Relations at Web State Vienna Private University, written a lot for Anglo papers, magazines, expert on geopolitics, energy, and immigration. Thank you very much. Love to have you on again soon. This is the Pelle Neroth.
Thanks, Pelle. Anytime.
Thanks a lot. We'll be back after the break.